So now I will invite Jean-Marc. So Jean-Marc is with the UQAM, Université du Québec à Montréal.
So thank you very much. The presentation is not really linked to the COVID-19, but it's more linked to a situation that was there before the COVID, and that will be very important after, when we'll be in the return to a certain kind of normality. So maybe we can go to the next slide. My presentation will be sharing two elements. So the research projects and the recommendations. So the research project. So we can change the slide. So when the research was done in partnership with a foundation from Quebec that is called Fondation Beatty. They had questions around the way they can set up a kind of standard for overhead cost. And they approached us in 2019 to start a research, and I mobilized the students, Antoine Gervais, to help me work on that, to answer the question that the Fondation Beatty had. So it was started in 2019. It was over by the in the middle of winter 2020, just before the pandemic, and we finalized the study in fall 2020 and start to valorize the results. It's the first phase of a research. The second phase will start in June this year. The first phase was only centered on literature review around writing that were done mainly in United States, some in Canada, around the issue of overhead. We had around 7 big questions that were set up at the beginning of the research, and I will just highlight the questions and elements of answers of findings relating to those questions. So the first one is the question around terminology. Is there a kind of standard terminology around the overheads? And the answer is no. There's a diversity of terms that are used: direct, indirect cost, administrative fee, operational cost, overhead. And between those notions, there's overlap, and sometimes there's not. So they have some type of specific elements of definition around specific words. Second question, how to identify and distinguish overhead from other costs? There's not a clear distinction between direct and indirect costs. We will see just a little later. I will show up a figure that highlight the different way of characterizing the cost in charities or a not-for-profit organization. So there's no clear definition, and there's no clear indication of what are the key components of each concept or notion that is utilized. A third question is related to a kind of standard. Is there a standard that can be used or that is used in the field? What we found is there's no one standard, but there's mainly a range of metrics that goes from 0%, what we call the lean approach, to 35% and above, that is really closer than to the real cost of posture. And we have between those two range a kind of mean between 10 and 20%, and a kind of informal rules around 15%. I remember before being a professor at UQAM, I was a director of a not-for-profit organization, and we were asking money from government. And in the proposal that we were submitting, I was always looking at the overheads around 15%, not because it was reflecting the needs of my organization, but because it was a kind of standard from the government to have very low overhead costs. Of course, it didn't help us, and it didn't help us realize the mission that we had. So we can go to the next slide. So another question that was asked is, are overheads part of a public policy? The answer we had is no now, but it was yes before. For example, the Sierra, they had a policy around 80-20, a kind of standard, 80% for operational cost and 20% for overheads. But that standard was only in use between 1976 and 2010. After 2010, there was a change in the law in a way to give more flexibility to a grant-making foundation and also to a not-for-profit organization. But in doing so, the kind of standard disappear. And now the only standard that is used is more related to the cost, related to the, when organizations are trying to leverage funds from other organizations, there's a kind of standard that is mentioned by CRA, but not for the usual work of charities or not-for-profit organizations. Next question we had is, are overhead costs a representative measure of philanthropic organization performance? One part of the literature say yes, and it is used in that way. And the other part, more recent, says that it's only one element to consider and it cannot be used solely. So it has to be combined with other elements of evaluation. Another question, what has the debate taking place in the United States taught us? That's very interesting because the debate in the United States started maybe in the middle of the 70s, and it was really around a kind of conservative approach, mainly to try to have a regulative posture toward not-for-profit organization. Then in the 90s and mainly in the beginning of this century, we had a new posture that is called the real cost posture that developed. And the population, I will say the philanthropic population is divided between those two postures. But the conservative approach is I will say it's more in position than the real cost posture. And that's revealed a paradoxical situation that is called the starvation cycle, because not-for-profit are not asking exactly the good cost for their overhead. They have to cut on their programmatic. And because of that, they are in a situation of what we call the starvation cycle. And I will illustrate what it means in a few minutes. Then the last question is, what lesson can be pulled from this debate and how do they allow for re-evaluation of the importance, place, role, and function of overhead costs in comparison to other expenditure? And my last slide will try to answer that question. So the next slides illustrate the way that, for example, the Internal Revenue Service in USA is looking at the overhead cost. The figure help to see how it's represent. On one side, on the left side, you have the program cost that is related to direct program staff, program supplies, program management, and administration. And on the right side, you have the management and general cost and the fundraising cost. They are often divided, those two kind of costs, with different kind of standards for each of them. For the management and general cost is the accounting and auditing, legal fees, insurance, real estate, administrative staff, and so on. And you have another elements that says that there's a relativity in the way of looking at the program and the management cost. What is interesting is the vocabulary that you see in these figures. There's no elements are related to benefits, to pension, long-term support, to research, to development strategy. You see, those are not classically looked as elements that can be considered as management or general cost. So there's a vacuum around the everything that is related to, for example, trainings of employees or doing R&D for the development of the organization. Those are classical elements that you encounter in private enterprise, But for social enterprise, social economy one, or not-for-profit, then it's not as usually considered as management and general cost. Next slide, please. So my next slide is trying to find a kind of collective, find a good balance between too much money that will go to overhead, what I call the SUR overhead. I'm not sure if it's good English way of saying it. And the other one is the under overhead situation. Between the two, you have the real cost project, and it's a relative situation, because if you have if you receive a lot of money, if you have a budget of 6 million, for example, then you could maybe have no difficulty with a 15% overhead. But if you have only a $500,000 budget, then it could be more important to have overheads around 20 or 25%. So the real cost project is relative to the situation that you are living or you are in. And of course, the mentality that we see in the grantees is more interest in the third scenario, the under overhead. They don't want to see much money that will go to the overhead. Next slides, please. And because of that, we have a situation that is called the the charity starving cycle, where you have unrealistic donor expectation toward low overhead. Because of the competitive pressure between charities, everybody played the role of their 10 to 15% overhead. And then you have misleading reporting because of you try to arrange your number to fit to the unrealistic donor expectation. And it makes a cycle where you provide less and less money to the overhead. And like that, you don't have augmentation of salaries, you don't develop a pension plan, you don't develop beneficiaries for your employees. And then people are leaving, and then you have difficulties in the realization of your mission. So it brings us to the almost the last diapositive, that is around defining but the recommendation. So we can change to the last slide. Thanks, Catherine. So the recommendation that we did for this first phase of the research are on 5 elements. The first one is we would like to have a glossary of terms that will be common to all stakeholders and that can generate a kind of consensus on the terminology that we'll be using. Another element that could be interesting is to produce a framework agreement on a management and administrative cost. For that, we need a very clear and democratic conversation between grantees and grantors. And we also need to have a conversation about the categories that we will put in the management and administrative cost. And because of the situation of the nonprofit, because they are receiving money from different directions, from government on one side, but also from different foundation, grant-making foundation, then we need a kind of we need to implement a mechanism for a concert action among funders to get a kind of specific way to consider the overheads in the project that they are financing. And then we need to pursue the research, and phase 2 of the research will be launched in June of this year to be able to develop a conversation with the grant-making foundation on one side, but also with not-for-profit organization, and to develop tools to be able to go toward the common glossary and a common typology for management and administrative costs. So those are the key elements that I was wanting to share with you about the research that we did on overhead costs. So the last slide is a kind of remerciement for this opportunity to present the research. Thank you very much.